Hi everyone, and welcome to Advanced JavaScript Lesson 5, where we will be going over buttons today. So the overview for today's lesson is, first we're going to be going over what a button is, then we're going to be learning how to create buttons in JavaScript, then we're going to learn about functions for buttons, and finally we're going to review or go over if statements with buttons. So some review questions before we start learning to get our brains working. The first question is, how do we access data from an object? So pause the video and try and remember how you access data from an object. Okay, so the way you access data from an object is you say object name dot property name. Next, how do we create a new property? Okay, so the way we create a new property is you say object name dot, and then you create your new property name, so you just name a new property equals, and then you make a new value for this new property you just created. Next, what is object-oriented programming used for? Okay, object-oriented programming is used as a template to create new objects. Finally, how do you call a function? So to call a function, you just say the function name, then in parentheses you have the parameter, then you end it off with a semicolon. So let's get learning. What is a button? A button is an object that we will be creating using the object template. They're used for clicking to complete an action, and you can see them being used in websites, games, movies, etc. Next, we're going to learn how to create a button. So you first want to create your button object. So var button name equals function x, y, width, height. This is our constructor function. Then you say this dot x equals x, this dot y equals y, this dot width equals width, and this dot height equals h. And here's an example. We have our button. We have our button function constructor. Then we create a new variable called button btn1 equals new button. So we're making a new object by saying new button. We're using the button template. And then we pass in our own values, which are 100, 100, 150, and 150. So step 1 is the button template. Create a button template with x, y, width, and height, and label. Now, we didn't really go over label in the previous slide, but label is also a parameter you're going to want to have, which is basically what is going to be inside the button. So pause the video and try and think of what type of data type would you want if we're going to think about the text that's inside of the button. Yeah, so it's a string, right? So we're going to want that as another parameter. And we'll expand on how label is a string in the future, but just for now include the variable label or the parameter label in your constructor function. So use all these parameters and use it to make a button object. So make your button template, make your button object, sort of like we did here. And then you don't need to draw the button right now, but just make the template. So pause the video. I'll give you guys like 5 to 10 minutes to work on this, or however much long you need. And then once you're done, you can come back and we will go over the answer. Okay, let's go over the answer, assuming that you took a shot at this project. It's fine if you weren't able to get it, because we're going to go over that now. So first, you're going to want to create your button template, which is var button equals function. We have x, y, width, height, and label. As we saw before, this dot x equals x, this dot y equals y, this dot width equals w, and this dot height equals h. And then we have this dot label equals label. Like I said before, we also have to make the label. And remember, this is going to be a string in the future. So when we create our button, our object, var btn equals new button, 200, 200, 150, 150. And then notice how for label we have a string. This is what what would be inside the button. So that's why I mentioned that there would be a string before this. So let's move on. Now let's go over config. Using config allows you to create an object within the button. Config is saying that the constructor values can be declared as any specific values, and it also allows you to use default values. So we'll go into a bit more detail. So this is the config template. We have var button name equals function. Then you only have one parameter when you're using config, which is just config. And then you say this dot x equals config dot x, or these two straight lines, it means or. On your keyboard, if you press, I think, shift and then it should be like at the very sort of top right, near the top right of your keyboard. If you do both of those in JavaScript, that's like saying or. So this.x equals config.x or default value. So you could put any value in the default value. Now, config, what it does is basically it does what we did before, except it makes your life a lot easier because you don't have to put all the parameters up here. And like I said before, it's basically saying that the constructor values can be declared as any specific values. So here's an example of using the config template. Var button equals function config. This.x equals config.x or 100. This.y equals config.y or 100. This.width equals config.width or 100. This.height equals config.height or 50. And this.label equals config.label or press me. And the reason why we have these default values is because when you're making your button object, if you do not fill in one of these values, it will just default to this value. Now, the syntax, before we continue, the syntax for creating an object using this template is different. So instead of just normally having parentheses and then just passing in all the values, we have to type out, it's sort of like an object inside the parentheses. So here we have var btn1 equals new button, we have our parentheses and we have our brackets, and then we treat it like an object. So we have our property name and then the value, comma, property name and the value, and so on. Now here's the template using config and default values like we said before. And here we have all three buttons that are created the same. And with config, you do not have to include properties. As we can see in button 2, the x and y value, it's not included here. Now what will the program do? It will use the default values, which for x it's 100 and for y it's also 100. And then the properties can also be listed in any order as seen in button 3. As you can see, we go x height width y, while here it goes x, y, width, height, but it still works. So these are sort of some benefits, some apparent benefits that can be seen with config. Step 2, adding config. Change, so the keyword is change. Change your button template to use config and default values and create 2 button objects with it. For one object, try using the default values. So pause the video, work on this step 2, and then we'll go over the answer to step 2 once you come back. Okay, let's go over the answer then. So, let's look at step 2. So as you can see, we have our config function. Var button equals function config. This.x equals config.x for 200, blah, blah, blah. We use for y, width, height, and label. You guys have already seen this. And then we create new 2 buttons, or actually here we create 1 button, but the project asks for 2 buttons. So we say var button equals new button. We have the x, y, but we don't have the width or the label. We have the height as well, by the way, but we don't have the width or the label. So it's going to default to the default values of the width and the label, which is 200 or 150, sorry, and press me. So that is how you would work on step 2. Let's move on to functions with buttons. So .prototype. .prototype allows you to add functions to your templates. So we've been talking about config templates, right? You can add functions to your templates using .prototype. For example, you can create a draw function for your button, so that draws out your button. Or you can create a isMouseInside function to check if the mouse is touching your button. In these functions, you can access the properties of each individual object with this dot property. When you create an object with your template, you can call the function with objectName.functionName. So let's look at the syntax for .prototype. So basically you just want to say the name of your button, .prototype.functionName equals function, and then create a custom function for the button. And make sure to write your .prototype functions after you write your constructor function. Otherwise JavaScript will become confused because you're using a constructor function that was never defined according to it. And here we have an example, button.prototype.draw equals function. So here's the name of the constructor function, .prototype. And then whatever you want to name your function, or you could think of it as like an add-on. We have fill, we use a rect to sort of make the button. It's because a button is a rectangle. However, notice how we use this.x, this.y, this.width, and this.height instead of just any random values. We have fill, text size, text align, and then for text, notice how we use this.label, this dot x, this dot y, and this dot height. And the code creates, the code adds the function draw to the button template. All buttons will be able to be drawn by calling btn, or whatever you named your object, btn.draw. So if you say this, then it will call this function. It's like calling a normal function. It will call this function and your button will be drawn out. Step 3, adding a draw function. So use .prototype to add a draw function to your button template that draws your button. Then call your function. Remember to use this .property. So pause the video and take a few minutes to work on, or however much time you need to work on this. We'll go over the answer once you come back. Okay, let's go over the answer. So let's see, we have step 3, button.prototype.draw, and then notice how we have all the stuff you need for usually drawing. Then for rect, we have this.x, this.y, this.width, this.height. And then for the text, we have this.label, this.x, plus this.width divided by 2. This is just to make sure that the text is in the middle. This.y plus this.height divided by 2. And notice how, and the reason why that this button is drawn out right here, like we can see a visible button, is because we say btn.draw. So remember, our object name is btn, right? Now we're gonna call the draw function within the btn. So when we say btn.draw, this button gets drawn out. If we didn't say this, then guess what? There would be no button, or at least when the program starts, there would be no button. It seems like we call it some other time in the program. Anyways, so that is how you do activity 3. Finally, we are going to go over if statements with buttons. So let's go over the mouse clicked function. So we have, this is the syntax for the mouse clicked function. We've gone over this in past projects, I believe. Var mouse clicked equals function, and then inside you put the code for what you want to do when the mouse is clicked. So anytime the user clicks their mouse in the canvas, any code inside of this function is going to be ran. Let's look at an example. Var mouse clicked equals function. If btn1.isMouse inside, println you made the right choice. Else if btn.2 is mouse inside, println you picked me. So this is a .prototype function. The isMouse inside is a .prototype function, which checks if your mouse is inside by using if statements. And basically what this does is when you click your mouse, basically if you hover over the first button and you click your mouse, then it's going to say you made the right choice. Otherwise, if you hover over the second button, btn2, and click your mouse, then it's going to say, yay, you picked me. So now we're going to do the final, or like the sort of final activity for this slide deck, which is the color button project. Create a button where when you click on the background behind it, or when you click on it, the background behind it changes color. So we've kind of made the steps that we need. Like we've already made our button.draw prototype function, we've made our button template, we've called our button, we've drawn our button, and this is what the project's going to look like. You click on the button and the background changes color. Now all you need to do is create your isMouseInside function, and then you also need to change the color of the background when the button is clicked, and you'd use the mouse clicked function for that. And then once you do that, you're pretty much done with the project. So we're almost there. We've kind of set you guys up. So the color button hints. Add a function to your button template, a prototype function, that checks if the mouse is touching / inside your button. And a few more hints within this is use .prototype and this .property, as well as if statements. Use mouse X and mouse Y to get the position of your mouse. And then this .prototype function should return true or false. And then also call that function inside the mouse clicked function. Make sure to use if statements. Change the background if the mouse is touching your button where the screen is clicked. When the screen is clicked. So basically, if your mouse is touching your button and the screen is clicked, make sure to draw the button. And then also redraw your button if you change the background, since if you change the background, the button will get covered up and then the user can't see it anymore. Oops. Okay, so pause the video and spend like however much time you need to finish up this project, and then we'll go over it. And yeah, so good luck guys, and come back once you're ready to see the answer. Okay, hopefully you were able to do that. So let's go over the answer now. Here we go. So we've already looked at this part, this part, this part, and this part. So now let's first look at the isMouseInside function. Button.prototype.isMouseInside equals function. If mousex is greater than or equal to this.x, and mousex is less than or equal to this.x plus this.width, and mousey is greater than this.y, and mousey is less than or equal to this.y plus this.width. Oh, I forgot to say this is, sorry, I said greater than. I meant greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. And then you return true if this is true. If all of this is true, then you return true. Otherwise, you just return false. So this code essentially checks if your mouse is hovering over the button. It checks your mouse X value and makes sure that it's greater than the X value of the button, but it also makes sure it's less than or equal to the X value of the button plus the width of the button. So since this is the X value, let's say, let me annotate, though this right here is like the starting X value of the button, right? And then it adds the width of the button, so it extends all the way here. So basically this code is checking if your mouse is anywhere between here and here. And then same with the Y. Y starts like, I think here, the top, goes to the bottom, checking if your mouse is hovering between here and here, since we're adding the width of the button to the original value, just to check. Okay. Finally, here we have our mouse clicked function like we talked about in the previous slides. We say if btn.isMouseInside background random 255 random 255 random 255. Remember the RGB scale, each value, so the red value goes between 0 and 255, the green value goes between 0 to 55, and the blue value goes between 0 to 55. And then finally we draw the button again so that it does not get covered up by the background. So hopefully you guys were able to at least do like a few steps of this project. It's totally fine if you weren't, like this part is tricky to do on your own, so it's fine if you weren't able to get this on your own. But if not, you can pause the video and copy this code down, and then you will have your finished product. And yeah, now let's move on to the recap questions. So there are 3 questions. First of all, why would we use config? Second of all, what does mouse clicked do? And then third of all, what do buttons do? And give an example. Now pause the video and try and answer all 3 of these questions, and then we'll go over all 3 of the answers. Okay, let's go over all the answers. Oh, actually, I don't think we have the answers here. Okay, yeah. So config is basically, let's go back to the slide so we can go over that. So using config allows you, as we've said before, it allows you to create an object within the button, and config is saying that the constructor values can be declared as any specific values, and it also allows you to use the default values. So when you're creating your button, if you do not put in a value for, like, for example, X, it will use the default value. And config, and that has many benefits. As we've said before, you don't have to include the properties, and the properties can be listed in any order. Next, what does mouse clicked do? So what mouse clicked does is it's a function which checks if your mouse is clicked. Finally, what do buttons do? Buttons, they take you to a different part of a website, or they take you to the next part of a game. There are many examples of what buttons do. Like I said, if you could click a button in a game and it takes you to like the loading screen, and buttons are everywhere on websites. You see buttons everywhere. So congratulations guys, you finished lesson 5. Good job everyone, and I hope to see you guys in lesson 6. Bye guys.